Hey everybody, it's Mike here from the We Rent Shop. Today we are going to be doing rear wheel bearings on my 2001 Mercedes-Benz E55 AMG. Let's get to work. The first step in the process is to remove the axle nut, and it's a 30mm 12-point. Next step is to remove the brake caliper, and we're going to do that by removing two 16mm bolts in the back. Next, we're going to take the axle off of the differential on the inner side. The bolt is an E12 inverted Torx. These bolts are usually very tight, so I'm using a 1/2-inch impact. Next, we want to get the rotor off, and to do that, we remove the rotor retaining screw, which is 5mm Allen. Got to coerce it with a rubber mallet because the parking brake shoes are behind this. The wheel hub is now exposed. Since we're dealing with a straight roller bearing, the bearing is going to press straight in. Then what happens is the hub presses into the inside of the bearing. First thing we want to do is we want to press this axle shaft out of here. The axle is splined to the hub, and this will not hammer out of here. You can beat on this all day long. So there's a better alternative to beating on it. We're going to use the Modulo 250 tool set sent to me by Godore. This tool set is a one-stop shop for almost all driveline pressing applications. The heart of the system is a 17-ton hydraulic cylinder that is actuated by this hand pump, and through a combination of threaded rods and fixtures, you can create a solution for almost any driveline pressing application that you would encounter in the field. Right now, the objective is to push the axle splines out of the hub. So we're going to set up the hydraulic cylinder where we will be pushing in on this spline right here, and we will counter hold against the hub. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use these adapters here. These will thread into the spots where the lug nuts go. Now we don't need tools to tighten these because with the hydraulics there's no tension. Next we're going to pull this adapter out of the drawer, and then 3 of these mounting nuts. The plate is fitted to the studs. Next we want to use these nuts. Now when you're setting this up, you want to make sure that the center of the plate is centered with the hub. And again, we do not have to use tools to tighten this. Now the next step is to pull the hub out from the bearing. If I wanted to use hydraulics to remove the hub, I would have to find some place to counterhold. Now we have all of our parking brake components here, and I do not want to remove those. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the hydraulic cylinder, and I'm going to use the slide hammer to pull the hub off. Can't forget my safety glasses. Next thing we want to do is get the snap ring off. These have a tendency of seizing. We spray some penetrating oil on it. And just with a hammer and a drift, I'm just going to try to move it. You just want to shock it. Now we're going to set up the hydraulics to actually pull this bearing from the housing. So since we're pulling out this way, we have to counterhold against the housing. There's a lot of fixtures and fittings in here to accomplish this. Usually here is where you would find something, but this one doesn't look big enough. I want to turn to the corner here. This is the one that we need. And I know that because it fits over this housing perfectly, and there's enough room for the bearing to come out. So we have a fixture for the front of the housing. Now we need a plate for the rear. So we're going to look here in this stack, and we're going to find a plate that accommodates the back side of the bearing. You may have to hunt and try a few. This fitting is to protect the hydraulic cylinder. This is going to go on the back side of the bearing. We have the speed nut and the threaded rod. So at this point in a wheel bearing install, I would be reaching for this Neanderthal of a tool. It basically has a selection of plates on a threaded rod here. And what you do is you slide this in here and you blast this thing with your 1/2-inch impact. I never really cared for it. I always thought it was very unsafe. I never had a lot of confidence doing it. But the way I'm about to show you will give you the confidence, and it's much safer. So what we are going to do now is assemble the hydraulic cylinder. Now instead of pushing, we want it to pull. So we will have power transmission from this side. Now we use this fitting to protect the hydraulic cylinder. Time to put it on the car. This is going to go on the back of the bearing. This surface will face the bearing. The threaded rod will come through here with the speed nut. There's a recess machined in there, so everything remains centered. This is how the speed nut works. Instead of having to thread it on, pinch these jaws, and it goes right on for you. You want to make sure that everything is centered, and the speed nut is in. So next step, the wheel bearing has to be pressed into the housing, and then the hub will be pressed into the bearing. And it's basically going to squeeze the bearing into the housing. The counterhold has to take place behind the housing. If you recall, when we pulled the bearing out, the counterhold was at the front. When we install, it's going to be counterheld from behind. So we need to find an arbor for the front of the bearing, and then an arbor big enough to create that counterhold on the back housing. So this one here, 80 millimeters. When you're pushing in a bearing, you want to get maximum contact with the outer race, but you don't want the arbor to be large enough where it will get stuck in the housing as well. So arbor selection is very important. So we got the front. Let's try this one for the back. I can see there's nothing restricting it. It has some play side to side and up and down. And it's very solid. I'm just going to go up underneath here and get a visual of it to make sure that it's nice and clear. Here's a better shot of that visual. You could see this plate goes right into the housing. There's nothing obstructing it. It's flat. That's the way you want it to be. Start with the bearing in the housing. We put the plate and the adapter that the threaded rod and speed nut will fit into. Now the hydraulic cylinder. Okay, everything is centered. I'm going to give a look underneath. Make sure I'm good. And I am. Let's start pressing. Move the speed nut in the back. And that bearing is pressed in. Next, we're going to install the new snap ring that came with the bearing kit. For this next part, we have to press the hub into the bearing. But the key this time is to support the inner race of the bearing from the backside. So we have to use a smaller arbor, just like this, because remember, we're exerting force this way, and we must counter hold in the opposite direction. If you don't support the inner race of the bearing, the force from pressing the hub will actually destroy it. The front of the hydraulic cylinder is going to remain as before. We have the protector plate, and we have this arbor. That is the size of the front of the hub here. We use the speed nut on the other side. We make sure that everything is centered. This is very, very solid. Let's hook up the hydraulics. Move the speed nut. To ensure that the axle fits back in here smoothly, I'm cleaning the splines with a wire brush. I'm also going to lightly coat the splines with this copper grease from Worth. Time to slide the axle back into the hub. The final step is to take this chisel and hammer in the nut so it locks to the spline.